Have you ever stood at the edge of the world, with nothing but the clothes on your back and the dust of 1,000 miles filling your lungs, waiting for a stranger to decide your fate? It is a terrifying silence that falls over the soul when survival hangs on the nod of a head or the pointing of a finger. The summer sun in the territory was not merely hot, it was a physical weight, a hammer that struck the earth relentlessly from dawn until dusk, bleaching the color from the grass and cracking the mud into jagged mosaics of thirst. May stood at the split-rail fence, her knuckles white where she gripped the weathered wood, the rough texture biting into her skin. She had walked for 3 days since the wagon had broken a wheel, and the group she was traveling with decided she was too much dead weight to carry. Her shoes were thin strips of leather that offered no protection against the scorching rocks, and the hem of her dress was torn and heavy with the gray dust of the road. She looked across the dry yard toward the small, sturdy cabin that sat in the shadow of the ridge. It was a lonely place, built by hands that understood the value of silence. A man stood on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, his shoulders broad and set with the tension of someone who lived his life waiting for trouble. This was Henry. He was older, his beard flecked with gray like iron filings, and his eyes were the color of the dry creek bed, hard and unreadable. He watched her for a long time, saying nothing, the cicadas in the dry brush screaming in the silence between them. May swallowed, her throat so dry it clicked audibly. She knew what she looked like to him, a complication, a mouth to feed, a drift of debris from a world that didn't want her. She did not ask for charity because she knew charity was a rare commodity in the West, rarer than water. She asked for a trade. She opened her mouth, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "I can work," she rasped, the words tumbling out before her courage failed. "I can cook. I can tend the garden. I do not need much." Henry did not move. He just watched her, his expression unyielding. May's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gestured toward the leaning structure 100 yards from the house, a dark shape against the blinding light. "I'll sleep in the barn," she begged, her voice dropping to a whisper, the shame of her desperation burning hotter than the sun. "I will not be in your way. Just, please, I'll sleep in the barn." The wind kicked up, swirling the dust around her skirt, and for a moment she thought he would tell her to keep walking, to take her chances with the coyotes and the heat. Henry tossed the rag onto the railing. He stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching heavily on the gravel. He walked to the gate, towering over her, smelling of horse sweat, tobacco, and old leather. He looked at the barn, then back at her, his brow furrowing deep. "Barn's for the horses," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the heavy air. "Roof leaks. Snakes like the warmth." He reached out, his hand large and calloused, and unlatched the gate. It swung open with a groan of dry metal. He stepped back, leaving the path open, not smiling, not welcoming, but allowing. "You'll stay with me," he said, the finality of it striking her harder than a refusal. "Inside, where it's safe." The interior of the cabin was a sudden, jarring shock of coolness after the relentless assault of the sun. It took May's eyes several long moments to adjust to the dimness, the world shifting from blinding white to shades of brown and amber. The air inside was still and smelled of coffee grounds and pine wood, a scent that felt impossibly civilized compared to the wild emptiness outside. She stood by the door, clutching her elbows, afraid to touch anything. The space was sparse, utilitarian. There was a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that radiated a dull heat, and a single bed in the corner covered with a heavy quilt. It was a bachelor's house, devoid of softness, every object serving a specific purpose. Henry moved past her, his presence filling the room. He did not look at her as he went to the stove, lifting the coffee pot to check its weight. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing vaguely toward the table. It wasn't a request. May moved carefully, pulling out the wooden chair and sinking into it. Her legs trembled uncontrollably now that the weight of walking was removed. She watched him, her dark eyes tracking his every movement. She was terrified of him, of this large, silent man who had let a stranger into his home, but the terror was dull compared to the sharp fear of the wilderness she had just escaped. Henry poured a tin cup of water from a bucket on the sidebar and set it in front of her. The water was lukewarm, but to May it tasted like salvation. She drank it too fast, choking slightly, the water spilling down her chin. Henry didn't scoff. He simply cut a slice of cornbread from a loaf on the counter and pushed it toward her across the rough wood of the table. "Eat slow," he said, his voice devoid of pity but heavy with instruction. "You'll make yourself sick otherwise." He pulled the other chair out and sat opposite her, the wood creaking under his weight. He didn't eat. He just watched her hands, small and trembling as she broke the bread. "I meant what I said," May whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "I can work. I am strong." Henry grunted, leaning back, crossing his arms over his chest. "We'll see," he said. The evening began to settle outside, the light turning golden and then purple through the open window. As the shadows lengthened, the intimacy of the one-room cabin became suffocating. There was only one bed. May looked at it, then at the floor, resolving silently to curl up on the rug near the stove. She would not presume. She would not take what was not hers. Henry stood up and walked to a chest at the foot of the bed, pulling out a spare blanket that smelled of cedar. He threw it onto the narrow cot, smoothing it out with surprising gentleness, then turned to her. "Take the bed," he said. May froze. "No, I couldn't. I will sleep on the floor. I am used to it." Henry shook his head, a stubborn set to his jaw. "I don't put guests on the floor, and I don't put women in the barn." He grabbed the blanket he had pulled out and walked toward the door, then stopped, looking back at the large armchair by the window. He threw the blanket over the chair. "I sleep light," he told her. "Take the bed. Rest your feet. Tomorrow is a work day." He sat in the chair, stretching his legs out, tilting his hat over his eyes to signal the conversation was over. May sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning softly. It was softer than anything she had felt in months. She lay down, her eyes fixed on the silhouette of the man in the chair, the gun belt hanging on the wall behind him. She didn't sleep for hours, listening to his breathing, waiting for the danger. But the only sound was the wind rising outside, brushing against the logs like a ghost seeking entry. The morning arrived not with a gentle light, but with a sudden, searing brightness that cut through the cracks in the shutters. May woke with a start, her heart pounding, momentarily forgetting where she was. The chair by the window was empty. The blanket was folded neatly on the seat. Panic flared in her chest. Had she been abandoned? Had he changed his mind? She scrambled out of the bed, her feet hitting the cool floorboards, and rushed to the door. She pushed it open and was blinded by the morning sun. Shielding her eyes, she saw Henry down by the corral breaking a bale of hay for 2 horses that looked as weathered as he was. He was working with a steady, rhythmic efficiency, ignoring the flies and the growing heat. May smoothed her dress, ran her fingers through her tangled hair, and stepped off the porch. She needed to prove herself immediately. If she was useless, she was gone. That was the rule of the frontier. She found a bucket near the well and began to draw water. The crank was rusted and heavy, screaming in protest with every turn. Her arms, thin from weeks of malnutrition, burned with the effort, but she clenched her teeth and forced the handle around. She would not stop. She hauled the brimming bucket up, water sloshing over her dusty shoes, and began to carry it toward the garden patch near the side of the house. The garden was a sad collection of struggling tomatoes and beans, fighting a losing war against the arid soil. Henry stopped his work. He leaned on his pitchfork, watching her from under the brim of his hat. He didn't come to help her. He didn't offer to carry the heavy load. He simply watched, assessing. May felt his gaze like a physical touch. She poured the water carefully at the base of the plants, the dry earth hissing as it drank. She went back to the well, again and again. By the fourth trip, her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and black spots danced in her vision. The sun was climbing, and the air was thickening with heat. On her fifth trip, her foot caught on a submerged root. She stumbled, the bucket swinging wildly, splashing water down the front of her dress and into the dirt. She fell to her knees, a cry of frustration escaping her lips. Before she could scramble up, a shadow fell over her. Henry was there. He reached down, not to take the bucket, but to take her arm. He pulled her to her feet with a grip that was firm but not bruising. "That's enough," he said quietly. May tried to pull away, panic rising. "I can do it! I am not weak! Please, I can finish!" Henry didn't let go. He looked at her flushed face, the sweat beading on her upper lip. "I know you can," he said, and the validation in his voice shocked her into silence. "But the well will run dry if you pull too much at once, and so will you." He took the bucket from her hand and set it down. "Go inside. Eat. There's cold beans in the pot." He picked up the bucket himself, his movements slow and deliberate. "We work until noon," he added, looking at the horizon. "Then we hide from the sun. That's how we survive out here. You don't fight the land, May. You endure it." It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange in his gravelly voice, foreign yet grounded. May nodded, her chest heaving, and retreated to the shade of the porch, watching him finish the row she had started. He wasn't kind, she realized. He was practical, and right now that felt safer than kindness. 3 days later, the isolation of the ranch was broken. May was inside, scrubbing the wooden floor on her hands and knees, the repetitive motion soothing her anxious mind. The house was beginning to look different. The dust was gone, the windows were clear, and the scent of sage and clean linen had replaced the stale air of a bachelor's existence. She heard the sound of hooves approaching, not the slow trot of Henry's workhorses, but the fast, aggressive cadence of riders. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in her stomach. She scrambled up, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and moved to the window. 2 men were riding up the path to the gate. They were dusted in trail grit, their hats pulled low, rifles scabbarded on their saddles. They looked like the men who had cast her out of the wagon train, men who took what they wanted. May backed away from the window, her breath hitching. The door opened and Henry stepped in. He had seen them too. He didn't look at her, but he moved with a sudden, terrifying speed. He reached for a rifle hanging above the door, checking the load in one fluid motion. "Stay inside," he said. His voice was different now, no longer the low rumble of the evening, but a sharp crack of command. "Don't come out unless I call you." He stepped back out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. May crept to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. She watched Henry walk to the edge of the porch steps. He didn't raise the rifle. He held it loosely in one hand, barrel pointed at the ground, but his stance was a stone wall. The riders stopped at the gate. "Henry?" one of them called out, a man with a scarred face. "Hot day for work." Henry didn't nod. "Hot day for riding," he replied. "What do you want, Vance?" The rider leaned forward, resting his hands on his saddle horn. "Heard you had a stray turn up. Some Chinese girl. Wagon train folks said they dropped some baggage." May squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clutching her skirt. "Baggage." "I got no strays here," Henry said, his voice flat. The rider laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Come on, Henry, we're just looking for a little fun. She can't remain here. It ain't right." Henry took one step down. The wood creaked. He shifted the rifle just an inch. "I said I got no strays. I have a guest, and you're trespassing." The silence that followed was long and heavy, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. The rider looked at Henry, then at the rifle, then at the dark windows of the cabin. He spat into the dust. "You're making a mistake, old man," the rider sneered. "She ain't worth a bullet." Henry didn't blink. "Get off my land." The rider glared, his hand twitching near his waist, but he saw something in Henry's eyes, a willingness to die, or perhaps a willingness to kill, that made him reconsider. He jerked his reins, turning his horse sharply. "Crazy old fool," he muttered. As they galloped away, disappearing into the heat haze, Henry stood there for a long time. He didn't relax until the dust settled. When he finally turned and came back inside, he looked exhausted. May was standing in the middle of the room. She looked at him, realizing for the first time that his stoicism wasn't just a wall to keep people out. It was a fortress to keep her safe. "They will come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Henry replaced the rifle above the door. "Maybe," he said. He looked at her, and his eyes softened just a fraction. "But not today." That evening, the heat did not break. It hung heavy and suffocating over the valley, pressing down on the roof of the cabin. The air was charged with electricity, the sky turning a bruised purple in the west. A summer storm was brewing, the kind that brought little rain but much fury. Henry and May sat at the small table, the remains of their dinner between them. The incident with the riders hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. It had shifted the dynamic. They were no longer just two people tolerating each other's presence. They were conspirators in survival. Henry pushed his empty plate away and poured a small amount of whiskey into his coffee cup. He hesitated, then poured a splash into May's tin cup of water. "For the nerves," he muttered. May stared at the amber swirl in the water. She took a sip. It burned, but the warmth spreading through her chest was welcome. "Why?" she asked suddenly. The single word seemed to echo in the room. Henry looked up, his brow furrowing. "Why what?" May looked at her hands, scarred from the garden work. "Why did you stop them? You do not know me. I am nothing to you." The wind outside howled, rattling the window pane, a precursor to the thunder that rumbled in the distance. Henry looked at the flickering lantern flame. He was silent for so long May thought he wouldn't answer. He wasn't a man of words. He was a man of actions. But the storm seemed to be loosening something in the foundation of the house, and in him. "I had a wife," he said, the words coming out rusty, as if unused for years. "Mary. She died 10 years ago. Winter fever." He took a drink of his coffee. "She used to say that a house without kindness is just a pile of wood. I forgot that for a long time. I let this place, and myself, turn into wood." He looked at May, his gaze direct and piercing. "You ain't nothing, May. You're alive, and you're fighting. That counts for something out here." The thunder cracked, loud and close, shaking the floorboards. May flinched, instinctively reaching across the table. Her hand brushed his. For a second, neither of them moved. His skin was rough, warm, and solid. Her hand was small, calloused, but delicate. The contact was electric, more shocking than the storm outside. Henry didn't pull away. He looked at her hand on his, then up at her face. The distance between them, usually measured in silence and polite reserve, suddenly felt vanishingly small. "You are not wood, Henry," she whispered. The rain began then, a sudden torrent hammering against the roof, enclosing them in a world of noise and water. In that small circle of lantern light, with the storm raging against the walls, the loneliness that had defined both their lives began to fracture. They sat there, the storm outside, the silence inside, and for the first time the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt raw and exposed, scrubbed clean of the dust but heavy with the scent of wet sage and mud. The morning light was different now, sharper, clearer, without the haze of heat that had obscured the mountains for weeks. May stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a shawl Henry had found in the bottom of the cedar chest. The air was cool, a rare mercy in this territory, but the destruction was visible. The wind had torn shingles from the roof, and a large cottonwood branch lay across the fence line, crushing the rails into splinters. Henry was already out there, his boots sinking into the softened earth, an axe resting on his shoulder. He looked older in the stark light, his movements stiffer than before. May watched him for a moment, her heart aching with a strange, new familiarity. Last night, in the dark, with the thunder shaking the walls, the distance between them had collapsed. Today, in the daylight, there was a hesitation to rebuild it. She walked down the steps, the mud sucking at her shoes. Henry turned at the sound of her approach. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, but the hard line of his mouth softened. "Roof leaked," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the cabin. "Chimney flashing gave way. Going to need tar." May nodded, stepping closer to the fallen tree. "I will help," she said. Henry looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the determination in her posture. "It's heavy work, May." She reached for the other end of the branch he was preparing to lift. "I am not glass, Henry. I will not break." They worked in silence for hours, the rhythm of the axe and the dragging of wood becoming a language of its own. It was intimate labor, their bodies moving in sync, sweat mixing with the cool air. When Henry swung the axe, he grimaced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. He dropped the axe, his hand going to his shoulder, the old fabric of his shirt straining. May was there instantly. She didn't ask permission. She reached out, her fingers brushing the damp cotton of his sleeve. "You are hurt," she stated. Henry tried to wave her away. "Old tear. Rotator cuff. It acts up in the damp." May shook her head. "Come inside." Inside the cabin, the light was dim and golden. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, his shirt unbuttoned and pulled down to his waist, exposing a landscape of scars and weathered skin that told the story of a hard life. His shoulder was bruised, the muscle tight and knotted. May stood behind him, her hands hovering for a moment before making contact. When she finally touched him, Henry flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of gentleness. Her hands were small but strong, her thumbs working into the knot of muscle with a surprising pressure. She smelled of rainwater and the lavender soap he kept by the basin. Henry closed his eyes, his head bowing forward. He had gone 10 years without being touched with anything other than violence or necessity. This deliberate care felt dangerous. It woke things up inside him that he had buried in the frozen ground with Mary. "You have hands like a healer," he murmured, his voice rough. May didn't stop. She moved her thumbs along the ridge of his spine, feeling the tension bleed out of him. "My father was a traditional doctor," she said softly. "Before the railroad. Before everything." She leaned in closer, her breath ghosting against his neck. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the unspoken. Henry turned his head slightly, and she froze. They were inches apart. He could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He wanted to lean back, to rest his weight against her, to let her carry him for just a moment. But he was a man who knew that softness was a liability in the West. He reached up, his hand covering hers on his shoulder, his grip firm. "That's enough," he whispered, though he didn't let go of her hand. He squeezed it, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles, a silent apology and a silent plea. "Thank you, May." She squeezed back, a brave, terrifying admission of attachment. "You are welcome, Henry." The peace of the morning was a lie. The territory did not allow for peace to last. It only offered pauses between hardships. 3 days after the storm, the heat returned with a vengeance, drying the mud into concrete and turning the sky a bleached, blinding white. But it wasn't the weather that put Henry on edge. He had found fresh tracks near the creek bed, shod horses, deep prints. Vance and his men were circling, testing the perimeter like wolves waiting for a weakness. Henry spent the mornings cleaning his rifles, the smell of gun oil permeating the small cabin. May watched him, the domestic tranquility they had built feeling fragile, like thin glass. She was sweeping the floor when Henry stood up from the table, holding a heavy revolver. He weighed it in his hand, then looked at her. "Put the broom down," he said. It was an order, but his tone was somber. May propped the broom against the wall. "What is it?" Henry walked over to her, reversing the grip on the gun and offering it to her handle first. The metal was heavy and cold in her palm. "If they come back," Henry said, "I might not be enough. You need to know how to use this." May stared at the weapon. It was an ugly thing, a machine of death. "I do not like guns," she said. "Neither do I," Henry replied, his face grim. "That's why I'm good with them. Come outside." Behind the barn, he set up a row of tin cans on the fence post. The heat was oppressive, sweat trickling down May's back. Henry stood behind her, positioning her body. He placed his hands on her waist to turn her hips, then moved to her arms, adjusting her elbows. His chest was pressed against her back, his height engulfing her. It was a shooting lesson, but it felt like an embrace. "Breathe," he instructed, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Don't hold your breath. Squeeze between the heartbeats." May was trembling, not just from the weight of the gun, but from his proximity. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the solid, unmoving strength of his presence. "I can't," she whispered. "I am afraid." Henry didn't step away. He moved his hand to cover hers on the grip, steadying the weapon. "Fear keeps you alive," he said. "Look at the target. Imagine it's the thing standing between you and living. Between you and me." The words hung in the hot air. Between you and me. He was including himself in her survival. May took a breath, steadied her hand against the anchor of his, and pulled the trigger. The kickback jolted her, but Henry's arms absorbed the shock, holding her steady. The can spun off the post. "Good," he murmured, his cheek brushing her hair. "Again." The attack did not come at high noon, but in the dead of night, under the cover of a moonless sky. The dogs Henry didn't own but fed occasionally started barking wildly, a jagged, frantic sound that tore through the silence. Henry was out of bed before May could even sit up, his rifle in hand. "Stay down," he hissed, moving to the window. A flicker of orange light danced across the wall. Fire. Vance hadn't come to talk. He had come to burn. "They torched the barn," Henry growled, the calm in his voice terrifying. The smell of smoke began to seep into the cabin, acrid and choking. "Get your shoes on," Henry commanded. "If the wind shifts, the house goes next." May scrambled out of bed, her fingers fumbling with her laces. Outside, a gunshot cracked, splintering the wood of the porch railing. Henry returned fire, the boom of his rifle deafening in the small space. He racked the lever with a mechanical precision. "Two of 'em by the gate, one circling back." He looked at May, his eyes blazing in the dark. "Take the pistol. Watch the back door. If anyone opens it, you shoot. You understand? You shoot until it clicks." May grabbed the revolver from the table, her hands shaking, but she nodded. "I understand." Henry went out the front door, into the inferno. May stood in the darkness of the kitchen, listening to the chaos outside, the shouting, the roar of the fire consuming the dry wood of the barn, the retort of gunfire. She was terrified, but beneath the terror was a cold, hard resolve. She would not let him die. The back latch rattled. It was soft, tentative. May raised the gun, holding it with both hands as Henry had taught her. The door creaked open, and a silhouette filled the frame. A man with a bandana over his face, holding a torch. He didn't see her in the shadows. May didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, the recoil jarring her shoulders. The man yelled, dropping the torch, and scrambled backward into the night, clutching his arm. May stood there, the smoke swirling around her, realizing she had crossed a line. She was no longer a victim. She was a defender of this house, of this man. The dawn broke over a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a skeleton of black timbers against the gray sky. The air was thick with ash that coated everything like gray snow. The riders were gone, driven off by Henry's aim and May's defense, but the cost had been high. The garden was trampled, the fence destroyed. Henry sat on the porch steps, his face streaked with soot and blood from a graze on his cheek. He was cleaning his rifle again, his movements slow and mechanical. May came out with 2 cups of coffee. She was covered in ash, too, her dress ruined, her hair wild. She sat beside him, handing him the cup. He didn't take it. He just stared at the smoking remains of the barn. "I can't keep you safe," he said, his voice hollow. "I thought I could, but I was wrong." May felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "We fought them off," she said. "We survived." Henry shook his head. "This time. Next time they'll bring more men. They'll burn the house." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of a heartbreaking defeat. "I'm packing the wagon. I'm taking you to the settlement at the crossroads. The sheriff there is a good man. He'll find you work. Safe work." May set the cup down, the liquid sloshing over the rim. "You are sending me away?" Henry clenched his jaw, looking away from her pain because he couldn't bear to see it. "I'm saving you, May. Look at this place. It's death. I'm just an old man waiting for a bullet. You have a life ahead of you." He stood up, abruptly, as if staying seated next to her would break his resolve. "Pack your things. We leave in an hour." He walked away toward the horses, his back stiff, a wall of stone once again. May sat alone on the porch, the ash falling softly around her, watching the man she loved try to break his own heart to save hers. Henry finished hitching the horses to the wagon. He worked with a brutal efficiency, not looking at the house. He was afraid that if he looked, he would see her standing there, and he wouldn't be able to do what needed to be done. He tossed a sack of supplies into the back and turned to call for her. She was standing on the porch, but she wasn't holding a bag. She wasn't wearing her traveling coat. She was holding the shovel from the garden. She walked down the steps, past the wagon, past him, and stabbed the shovel into the blackened earth near the ruins of the barn. She kicked it deep, turned a clod of ash and dirt, and looked at him. "I am not going," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard with the force of a thunderclap. Henry walked over to her, his expression pained. "May, don't make this harder. You can't stay." May rested her hands on the handle of the shovel. "You said the barn was for horses," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You said I would stay inside, with you." She stepped closer to him, ignoring the soot on his face, the blood, the fear. "I am not a stray you found on the road anymore, Henry. I am not a guest." She reached out and took his hand, the one that had held the gun, the one that had held hers during the storm. "I slept in your bed. I drank your water. I fought for your home. This is my home, too." Henry looked down at her, his resistance crumbling like the burnt timber of the barn. "I have nothing to give you," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Just hard work and a hard life." May smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile. "I do not want easy," she said. I want this. I want you." She raised her hand to his cheek, wiping away a smudge of ash with her thumb. "The barn is gone," she whispered, "so I will have to sleep in the house forever." Henry let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 10 years. He covered her hand with his, pressing it against his face. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, surrendering to the terrifying hope she offered. "Yeah," he rasped, the word thick with emotion. "Yeah, you stay with me." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her tight against the vast, empty backdrop of the west. The sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the charred land, but also the green shoots of the garden that had survived the trampling. They stood there, two survivors in the wreckage, no longer alone, ready to rebuild from the ashes.